You do not leave these conversations bleeding. You leave them shrinking. The most destructive psychological violence you will ever endure does not sound like a scream. It does not sound like a threat. It sounds exactly like a polite suggestion. The people actively dismantling your self-worth are not physically overpowering you. They are not raising their voices to dominate the room. They are quietly, surgically hacking into your central nervous system, and they are doing it while smiling directly into your eyes. Watch closely how they react. You are sitting at a brightly lit office desk. You lean forward to share a new project strategy. Your vocal pitch elevates slightly with natural enthusiasm. The person across from you maintains a completely relaxed, open posture. They do not mirror your energy. They tilt their head just a fraction of a degree. They let exactly 1.5 seconds of dead air fill the space. Then, they speak. They use a soft, perfectly controlled, low-frequency tone. That is a really ambitious way to approach it. I remember trying something similar when I was a junior. They do not break eye contact. They smoothly raise a mug and take a slow, deliberate sip of coffee. But here is the brutal physical reality. Instantly, your shoulders drop by a fraction of an inch. Your blink rate doubles involuntarily. You physically retract your body weight. You pull your forearms completely off the surface of the desk. No formal insult was ever registered on audio. Not a single corporate policy was violated. Yet a total, undeniable physical submission has just occurred. Why does a completely polite string of words bypass your logical brain entirely? Why does it trigger the exact same physiological threat response as a physical shove? You feel the sudden, localized chest tightness. You feel the immediate onset of cognitive fog. Your autonomic system believes it is under imminent attack. The actual fatal mechanism is deeply mechanical. What invisible, predatory biological process is actually at play here? Subtle belittling is never a personality flaw. It is absolutely not a simple communication error. It is a highly predatory, subconscious survival strategy. The aggressor is actively executing a code to hijack your neurochemistry. It is a calculated, clinical behavioral strike. They are extracting power without leaving a single trace of visible evidence. There is nothing for human resources or social circles to legally punish. The human brain possesses an ancient threat detection center called the amygdala. It does not differentiate between a physical predator and a social one. When you experience subtle social rejection, a very specific neural circuitry fires. The anterior cingulate cortex activates immediately. This is the exact same hardware your brain uses to process actual physical pain. A polite insult enters your auditory cortex. Your brain immediately categorizes it as an incoming biological threat. This triggers a slow, deliberate release of cortisol directly into your bloodstream. The cortisol drips steadily into your system, flooding your cellular receptors. This induces a highly localized state of hyper-arousal. Your heart rate variability drops off a cliff. You are instantly pushed into a state of involuntary cognitive paralysis. The aggressor understands exactly how to weaponize something called prosody. Prosody is the underlying rhythm and acoustic tone of human speech. They deliver a devastating psychological attack using a calm, low arousal vocal register. This acoustic data enters your ear canal and completely bypasses your prefrontal cortex. Your prefrontal cortex is responsible for logical processing and threat classification, but the audio signal sounds harmless, polite, and completely regulated. Your brain physically cannot classify the event as a hostile attack. This creates a violent state of internal cognitive dissonance. Your nervous system feels chemically assaulted by the massive cortisol spike. Yet your ears hear absolutely nothing but socially acceptable, harmless audio. This mechanical contradiction forces your brain to turn the suspicion inward. Your neurology defaults to self-blame to resolve the conflicting sensory data. Evolutionary psychology dictates a harsh, inescapable biological truth. The human brain is constantly scanning the environment for hierarchical placement. The aggressor utilizes a mechanism known as relative status lowering. To secure dominance, They do not need to exert the energy to elevate their own competence. That requires actual effort and immense biological resources. Instead, they execute a precise, microscopic linguistic maneuver against you. This maneuver is designed to artificially suppress your dopamine levels. It directly crashes your serotonin production in real time. They secure a dominant hierarchical position, strictly through subtraction. They push your neurochemistry down to the floor. Therefore, they biologically rise above you. Watch closely how they react. You are sitting in a standard conference room, presenting data. Your supervisor does not utter a single word of verbal critique. Instead, the exact second you begin speaking, they slowly break eye contact. They shift their gaze to stare blankly at a specific empty spot on the projection screen. They release an almost inaudible sigh strictly through their nose. It is a deliberate, calculated exhalation of air. They pick up a plastic pen from the table. They begin tapping it against their own thigh. The rhythm is agonizingly slow and intentionally irregular. The environmental tension physically thickens in the room. You inevitably stumble over your own words. Your speech pattern fragments under the unacknowledged pressure. The supervisor finally looks back at you. They offer a tight-lipped, closed-mouth smile. They show absolutely zero teeth. They maintain dead silence for exactly 3 seconds. Then, they coldly move to the next agenda item. The actual fatal mechanism is something clinical called allostatic overload. Your autonomic nervous system sustains chronic, cumulative wear and tear. You are subjected to relentless, low-grade, invisible biological stress. This internal damage manifests directly in your physical behavior. You develop spontaneous, uncontrollable speech hesitation. You begin a permanent habit of chronic preemptive self-editing. Your body literally begins to decrease its spatial occupation. Your posture permanently hunches forward to protect your vital organs. You physically shrink your own volume before you even step foot into a room with them. You have been entirely biologically subjugated. But this highly effective predatory behavior does not come from strength. It is absolutely not born from a position of neurological superiority. If we clinically map the aggressor's brain during these interactions, we find a very different truth. We find a biological system in absolute terrifying freefall. The habitual diminisher is absolutely not exhibiting human confidence. They are running a desperately outdated biological survival script. This script was hard-coded into their nervous system during early childhood. Their developing brain learned a terrifying and permanent lesson. They learned that psychological safety is a strict zero-sum game. For them to feel biologically secure, someone else must mathematically lose. They do not possess internal confidence. They possess a survival reflex. Look precisely at their early developmental stages. Their emotional environment was highly volatile and deeply conditional. Validation was not freely given. It was a scarce, competitive resource. The child's developing prefrontal cortex failed to build a crucial neurological bridge. They never developed a stable internal working model of self-worth. Their baseline state of existence is a terrifying internal void. Because they cannot generate their own emotional regulation, they must extract it. They are left permanently, helplessly dependent on external regulatory inputs. They must feed off the emotional state of the people around them. The actual fatal mechanism is a brutal ego defense. Their psyche is constantly bordering on total, paralyzing ego annihilation. The feeling of being less than is processed as a literal death threat by their brain. To survive this internal terror, they deploy projective identification. They subconsciously isolate their own deep-seated feelings of chronic inadequacy. Then they forcefully eject that psychological poison out of their own body. They deliberately inject it into an external target. By making you physically shrink, they temporarily excrete their own internal shame. They use your nervous system as a biological dumping ground, and it gets worse. Their brain is fundamentally starved of intrinsic neurochemical reward. They possess a severe dopaminergic dysregulation. They cannot validate themselves, so they rely on parasitic dopamine hits. They provoke a highly specific physical reaction from you. They watch for your micro-flinch. They wait for your speech hesitation. They scan your face for the exact moment self-doubt registers in your eyes. That visible physical submission triggers a sudden, extrinsic dopamine release in their brain. This microdose briefly stabilizes their volatile, chaotic nervous system. Watch closely how they react. You are sitting at a standard family dinner. A daughter casually mentions receiving a highly competitive job offer. The mother's jaw muscles visibly tighten in a microsecond. Her gaze flickers rapidly to the side. She forcefully breaks all visual contact. She abruptly shifts her physical posture. She straightens her spine to sit unnaturally, stiffly rigid. She clears her throat to reset her vocal cords. She speaks in a perfectly smooth, controlled tone. That is nice. Let us hope the stress does not cause you to burn out like last time. Your brother just got promoted again, by the way. The mother is experiencing rapid, shallow chest breathing throughout this entire exchange. That erratic breathing only slows down and regulates when one specific thing happens. It regulates the exact second the daughter's smile physically drops. The aggressor suffers from a complete biological inability to experience genuine intimacy. Their neurobiology is permanently locked in a sympathetic survival state. Their nervous system cannot process joy for another human being. They constantly misinterpret genuine human connection. They view your personal success as a direct, existential threat to their own physical autonomy. They are trapped in a high-alert physiological prison of their own making. They cannot be cured by your love. This internal void demands constant, relentless, parasitic feeding. They must consume the confidence of others to maintain their own homeostasis, which means the absolute greatest threat to their physiological stability is singular. It is a target who suddenly refuses to provide the emotional nutrition they require. True emotional independence is never perceived as neutrality. Unbothered silence does not compute as a peaceful boundary. It is processed by their brain as a critical physiological threat. You are actively cutting off their psychological life support. Their entire survival mechanism relies entirely on extracting your emotional energy. When you withhold that energy, their internal system violently crashes. They are suddenly starved of their required biological regulation. Your calm neutrality is interpreted as an act of severe existential violence. You are forcing them to face the abyss of their own insecurity. The actual fatal mechanism is a profound mirroring deficit. The diminisher strictly requires your overt emotional reaction to function. They need your visible defensiveness, your physical shrinking, or your anger. They use your over-explaining to act as a psychological mirror. This mirror artificially confirms their own existence and absolute superiority. When you offer zero reaction, you shatter that mirror completely. The diminisher's psyche suddenly faces a terrifying empty void. They can no longer see their inflated self-image reflected in your pain. This sensory deprivation triggers immediate, acute clinical anxiety. Their brain registers this absence as a catastrophic narcissistic injury. But here is the brutal physical reality. Deprived of their external regulatory mechanism, their biology revolts. Without your visible distress to soothe them, their sympathetic nervous system spikes uncontrollably. Their baseline heart rate rapidly accelerates. They enter an immediate, involuntary biological fight response. Their speech pacing drastically increases to fill the agonizing silence. Their vocal volume predictably escalates in a desperate bid for control. They pivot instantly from covert manipulation to overt, aggressive hostility. They are literally fighting to force a physical reaction from your body. They must break your silence to regain their own internal homeostasis. And it gets worse. Silence requires incredibly high distress tolerance and internal self-regulation. Without an external interpersonal conflict to distract them, their brain alters its state. The default mode network in their brain forcibly turns inward. This neural network aggressively exposes their own deeply repressed inadequacies. They are suddenly trapped alone, with their own intense feelings of worthlessness. The cognitive pain of facing themselves is physically unbearable. They must physically shatter the silence in the room to escape it. They attack you simply to successfully distract their own neurology. Watch closely how they react. You receive a highly calculated, subtly condescending remark. You respond only with a completely flat, neutral sound. You maintain perfectly relaxed facial muscles and an open, untensed posture. You execute a steady, slow, measured breathing pattern. Instantly, the aggressor's pupils noticeably dilate. They forcefully lean forward, shifting their entire body weight toward you. They cross the invisible boundary directly into your physical proximity. They are now positioned less than 2 feet from your face. Their speech rate aggressively accelerates by roughly 30%. They rapidly fire 3 consecutive, completely unprompted questions. They deliberately interrogate you about your specific past failures. Their hands gesture sharply and erratically directly in your visual field. They physically attempt to dominate the space and violently force eye contact. The aggressor entirely loses control of their carefully curated, calm facade. They escalate rapidly from covert manipulation to erratic hostility. This public explosion ultimately exposes their severe emotional dysregulation. They display their internal chaos clearly to the broader social group. They systematically dismantle their own carefully constructed social camouflage. Understanding this mechanical, almost pathetic neuro loop is the prerequisite for freedom. But knowing why a machine is trying to crush you does not stop it from crushing you. You must actively rewrite the physical coding of your own response. Cognitive empathy for their childhood trauma is completely biologically irrelevant to your safety. Understanding their pain does not mitigate the physiological damage they inflict on your body. Your psychological survival strictly requires one specific mechanical action. You must sever the emotional feedback loop permanently. You execute this through a clinical process called behavioral extinction. The actual fatal mechanism is rooted in basic operant conditioning. You are about to abruptly stop rewarding an established parasitic behavior. You are actively withholding your visible emotional distress. When you cut off this critical supply, the aggressor will not simply walk away. They will immediately increase the behavior's frequency and aggressive intensity. Psychologists document this highly predictable event as an extinction burst. Their nervous system panics and doubles down to force your submission. They will push harder, speak faster, and attack more directly. You must mathematically outlast this temporary biological spike in aggression. You simply wait for their neurochemistry to exhaust its own fuel. But here is the brutal physical reality. You cannot survive this aggressive spike using willpower alone. You must intentionally engage your own parasympathetic nervous system. You initiate slow, diaphragmatic breathing directly during their covert attack. This deliberate physical action actively prevents your own amygdala from hijacking your brain. You force maximum, uninterrupted blood flow to remain in your prefrontal cortex. You retain full access to your logical processing centers. This allows for cold, rational, detached observation of their frantic behavior. You entirely bypass your hardwired impulsive trauma response. You remain biologically anchored to the floor while they spiral. And it gets worse. You must forcibly separate 2 deeply entangled neurological responses. You must decouple the physical sensation of setting a boundary from the emotional guilt installed by past conditioning. Your brain has been falsely trained to associate resistance with shame. You must physically retrain your neural pathways to recognize a new biological truth. Peace is absolutely not the absence of external conflict. Peace is the rigid maintenance of your internal structural integrity. It is holding your physical ground regardless of the external stimuli attempting to breach it. You lock down your borders and let them hammer against the walls. Watch closely how they react. A senior colleague attempts a highly public subtle put down during a team evaluation. You are the targeted employee in this exact scenario. You do not drop your gaze by a single millimeter. You do not offer a nervous, placating smile to diffuse the tension. You absolutely do not rush to frantically justify your work. Instead, you place both of your hands entirely flat on the table surface. You take a slow, measured, 4-second nasal inhalation. You reply using a perfectly flat, inflection-less, low-pitch voice. "I have noted your perspective on the timeline." You then immediately turn your head precisely 45 degrees. You address the person seated directly to your left. You completely withdraw all visual and auditory attention from the aggressor. You abruptly and permanently terminate the power exchange. You have executed a definitive physical extraction. You are completely removed from the aggressor's emotional regulatory system. The aggressor is instantly left structurally and biologically isolated. They generated a massive spike of toxic, hyper-aroused neurochemistry. Now, they are forced to metabolize it entirely alone. They no longer have a human host to absorb their poison. They must swallow it themselves. The ultimate victory over covert manipulation is never found in a dramatic confrontation. It is absolutely not found in a screaming match. It is found in the quiet, devastating realization of biological reality. These individuals are absolutely not playing four-dimensional chess. They are not strategic masterminds, executing complex psychological warfare. They are permanently trapped in a primitive, repeating neurobiological loop of fear. They are literally drowning inside their own dysregulated nervous system. Their only survival strategy is to use your psychological stability to keep themselves afloat. They desperately need you to act as their biological life raft. Once you see the precise, mechanical nature of their profound insecurity, everything changes. Their carefully chosen words immediately cease to be weapons. They become exactly what they physically are. They are a clinical, desperate diagnostic readout. They are the external symptom of a rapidly failing psychological immune system. You are not dealing with a position of power. You are dealing with a profound, completely untreated clinical pathology. The actual fatal mechanism is exactly how you respond to this data. You must actively execute the void protocol. When facing a covert diminisher, you must intentionally remove all emotional resonance. Drain the emotion completely from your face. Strip all tonal variation from your vocal cords. Eliminate all erratic, defensive micro-movements from your physical posture. You offer absolutely zero defensiveness to their verbal bait. You provide zero logical explanation for your independent actions. You display zero retaliatory anger in your eyes. You let their calculated passive aggression drop into an absolute suffocating vacuum. Watch closely how their biology responds to this terrifying absence. Watch their nervous system enter a state of visible physical panic. Watch it completely fail to extract the dopamine it desperately needs from your distress. You absolutely do not need to fight them verbally. You absolutely do not need to fix their broken psychology. You only need to mathematically starve them of your physiological reactions. You wait out the extinction burst. You hold your physical ground until their biology is forced to seek another host. If this biological breakdown just systematically dismantled a toxic dynamic, if it broke a mechanical cycle you have been carrying for years, you know exactly what to do. Subscribe to the channel right now. The world is heavily populated with active psychological predators. They rely entirely on your conditioned polite silence to survive their own neurology. We are going to clinically map every single one of their biological blind spots. We will dismantle their machinery part by mechanical part. Stay anchored. See you in the next deep dive.